You want to finish what you started? You came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, Oconomowoc in the house.
All right. We are recording another episode of the New Look podcast. We're going to be taking a new look at Hollywood. Not often a subject we get to discuss, but very excited to have the author of a new book, which is fascinating and a great read, Chris Fenton, who's recently wrote Feeding the Dragon: Inside the $1 Trillion Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Business. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's an honor. Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, let's just start. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? How'd you wind up at Cornell?
I was born and raised actually down in South Florida, big Miami Hurricane fan, and on an island called Singer Island, which was off the coast of West Palm Beach. It was one island north of Palm Beach. Sort of a middle class, upper middle class part of the country. Went to a school. The school system wasn't great down there, so I went to a private school. It was definitely difficult for my family to afford it, but they sent me there. It was called the Benjamin School. I actually got to know a former colleague of yours there named Tom Rooney.
Who's in the book, briefly.
He is in the book.
Man.
He was actually very helpful to me with getting the sort of the mission out in regards to my endeavors with China. And then my father did work as an engineer for United Technologies, a division of that called Pratt & Whitney. They made airline engines. When I was entering high school, he got transferred up to Connecticut. So I graduated a public high school called Glastonbury High School in the middle of the state. And then ended up going to Cornell. I actually thought for a bit about going to West Point. I went to their summer program and ended up not going there and took a ROTC scholarship to Cornell. Unfortunately, not like yourself, I ended up doing it for 1 year and then opted not to continue it. So I didn't actually end up serving post college, but had a great time at Cornell, got an engineering degree there, and then sort of graduated at a tough time economically, not as bad as it is now, but in 1993, it wasn't great. Didn't have a lot of opportunities and hopped on the road and slept on couches of my fraternity across the country. Spent about 7 months traveling the country, went to a bunch of different cities, college towns, and had a real good time, and came out and visited a couple of friends in LA and never left.
That's great. Well, so your engineering degree and your facility with numbers ends up playing an important role in your Olive Garden career. But before we get there, I want to talk about something I think is very valuable, something I believe your dad taught you, which is your rolodex system. Explain not only your rolodex system, but how, for the young kids listening to this who may not know what a rolodex is, how they might modernize it and implement it in today's day and digital age.
Yeah, that's it. It's sort of an interesting theme I have in the book because a lot of people, as they're starting off their career, find out that you hear this thing that connections are everything, but you never really understand exactly what that is. But I surely did, and that essentially is something that my dad taught me as a kid. Said everybody you ever meet in life, just write down what you remember from that conversation and keep it somewhere safe so that if you ever run into them again, you can bring up really interesting tidbits that they'll be very shocked that you remembered. So I used to do that on the back of a Rolodex card, and to date, I could probably actually go into my garage and bring them out. But I have these massive Rolodexes with all these people I've met over the years and all their fun, facts and interesting little trivia hints that in the book actually come to help me out quite a bit, because there's people that I hadn't talked to in many years that I had to call upon in order to get certain things done. And I really thank my dad for that great tidbit of advice.
This is unusually helpful to me because despite now being in politics for 4 years, I'm terrible with remembering names and faces. I've tried every mnemonic device and it never works. So I have to externalize my brain when it comes to this stuff. And so I started to take notes in the context of my phone about people, and sort of it's kind of a modern version of your Rolodex process.
Yeah, well, the great thing nowadays, and it's sort of bad for me because it takes my advantage away, I guess. But the internet is so good at pulling up images of people, or just finding out little tidbits. And obviously, you can go on your Wikipedia page and find out you actually are a Californian for at least part of your life and went to one of the top athletic schools out here. They seem to beat our high school quite often in various sports.
I did not contribute much on the athletic front. So the short, uncoordinated kid was not part of modern day's great basketball and football teams.
Well, I spent a lot of time on Cornell's freshman football team bench, so I know the feeling.
So obviously, you come to Hollywood, you want to work in the entertainment industry, but it's very competitive. You're not immediately installed as a high-powered producer. And so you end up, I think there's a point in the book too, where you even talk about how difficult it was to get a job as a bartender or a waiter, just because it's like, the Super Bowl for talented, good-looking actors who are having to wait tables and be a bartender. Talk about what led you to work at Olive Garden for a while.
Yeah, well, it's funny, even before that, I never intended to move to LA or work in the entertainment business. I actually had no idea what the entertainment business was. I mean, I knew there were actors and directors, but that was about it. In 1993, when I graduated, and I eventually came out in early 94, but there were two places in the country that were sort of booming at the time, and everywhere else was sort of depressed. Las Vegas was booming because they were starting to build these big casinos. So I thought of maybe living there, and enrolled in blackjack dealing school and stuff like that. I was living at the Circus Casino for $65 a week. And then when I went to visit LA, I was like, wow, this place is amazing. But between Vegas and Seattle, those were the only places that were booming. Los Angeles, everybody was leaving. It was just after the fires had torn through Malibu and Laguna. The defense industry had packed up and left a couple years prior. A lot of people were moving into Colorado, Nevada, Texas at the time. And I had just been lucky enough to move to town about 2 weeks before the big Northridge earthquake. So between that and the floods in that fall, no one wanted to be in LA. But when you get here and you see it's 72 and sunny every day, and there's palm trees and beautiful people, and just this really interesting energy that I hadn't experienced being on the East Coast, I said, geez, I got to give it a shot. So I was flat broke. I had no money. So I thought maybe I could use my bartending skills from college town Cornell in LA. And then I found that there was a pecking order just to become a bartender in Los Angeles, mainly because of all the out of work actors that were doing it for, a decade or so. So I got the first job I could get in order to afford living, which was a job at the Olive Garden right outside UCLA, and got through their Hospitaliano school and became a waiter there, and was able to at least make ends meet while I tried to figure out the next step, which ultimately was influenced to me by two guys I was waiting on tables for. One of them was a young agent who had just left to produce a movie. His name was Chris Moore, and he went on to produce Good Will Hunting and the American Pie franchise, a really great guy, and produces all of Matt Damon's movies. He said, hey, why don't you get into the entertainment business? It's the Wall Street of the 90s is the way it was told to me. So I said, oh, great, let's figure it out. Like, how do I get in? He's like, you just got to meet people and start the network. So he's like, come on into this basketball league I have on Wednesday nights, and you can meet some of the guys that are in it. And what was amazing is I showed up as there was I don't know if it's still around, but Details Magazine was doing a magazine shoot of this pickup basketball league. And it was a bunch of young actors and agents no one had ever heard of, and producers. And I looked around and I didn't recognize anybody, but it turned out a lot of them turned into something. It was Matt Damon and Ben Affleck and Matthew McConaughey and Ari Emanuel and Patrick Weitzel, who became big agents. And it was literally a who's who of Hollywood 10 years after that. But at the time we were all just, young bucks trying to figure out how to navigate the crazy Hollywood jungle.
So, and then well, first of all, you hack the Olive Garden formula with a basic understanding of numerators and denominators that allows you to become like the all-time best-selling employee. Ultimately, you're undone by your excessive love of tiramisu. Does this addiction to tiramisu continue to today?
You know, it's become such a joke now that anytime there's something that's, if I'm out to dinner with some people or something, the joke has made the rounds out here in LA County for years. So it seems like there's always some surprise tiramisu that shows up at the table at the end of the night. So I am still pretty addicted to it, I got to say. But I, in attempting to keep my face for radio from becoming Elvis's head, I try to just eat the top where the cream is.
There you go. That's a good hack. So you finagle kind of a mailroom job at forgive me if I'm screwing up any of the details, at William Morris, but you ultimately end up through that process of, human connection. I think in this case, the connection you built with someone's assistant, becoming the youngest agent in town. How old were you when you finally kind of got that first big Hollywood job?
Yeah, I was 20. I ended up becoming, like, the biggest goal in Hollywood at the time was to well, first of all, get an assistant job, but then to go from being an assistant to having an assistant. And I did that extremely quickly. Part of the reason was I had some really good mentors that believed in me. I had the vice chairman of the company, a guy named Jerry Katzman, who loved me literally because I had no connection in the business, which was very unusual to get into the mailroom. And I talk about that process. And part of the reason I wrote the book was really for younger readers to read it and go, geez, this guy is now on, I don't know, Tucker Carlson, CNBC or whatever, talking about China. I wonder how he got there. Well, guess what? It's not like you start off as a genius expert in anything. You just sort of, live life as best you can and look for opportunities, and hopefully you get to a position someday where you feel like you achieve some success. And I fell into a temp job, and I worked my way into an official mailroom job, and then worked my way into an agent trainee job. And the vice chairman was blown away that I had no connection to the business at all, and I got to that position. And then B, I think more importantly, he asked me one day what kind of suit I was wearing, and I said, "Oh, you like it?" And he's like, "Well, it's interesting looking. Where was it made?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know." And I opened it up, and I was like, "Oh, Yugoslavia." And he's like, "Where did you buy that suit?" And keep in mind, the suits that these agents wear are more expensive than a lot of people's cars. And I said, "Oh, I bought it up in Hollywood on Hollywood and Vine, that place. I don't know. I forgot the name of it." He's like, "Well, what did it cost you?" And he's like, "Well, it was actually a pretty good deal. I got 3 suits for $99. And he's like, "You got to be my assistant. You're going to crack me up all day long." So I ended up becoming his assistant, and he promoted me very quickly once I learned the ropes.
Well, one of the things I appreciate about the book, kind of in line with advice for the younger generation, is you're very candid, both about the nature of your success, but also some failures along the way. You don't try and paint this as just a straight meteoric rise, and obviously part of that is the William Morris story that ended up not working out. But maybe take us through, after William Morris, how you kind of rebounded from that, and ultimately how does that lead to your awareness of China and DMG?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up, all these situations when you're in these companies, as anybody will find out, or as you probably know really well, and I'm sure Congress is the same way, there's a lot of interesting politics that go on. And sometimes you end up on the right side of them, which I did, to get promoted. And then over time, we had a new management come in, and I ended up on the wrong side of it. So I did get unceremoniously fired, and I'm very open about that in the book, mainly because I wanted people. You know what? If you come off as an expert and you act like you're something that is better than other people, people are going to tune out and they're not going to listen to you. And quite frankly, one of the most interesting parts of me understanding China in the way that I do is that I sort of fell into it like a Michael Keaton in Gung Ho or something like that, a real fish out of water. And I spent 20 years in the applied, practical, commercial and cultural exchange between these two superpowers with all kinds of conflicts. That's my experience and that's my expertise. I wasn't a PhD in China studies, and I don't even really see myself as a true expert. So one of the things that I wanted to do was explain to people how I got into it and how I sort of fell into it. And quite frankly, part of how I fell into it was getting fired from a job that I thought was really going to be the destination of most of my career. And it was really a flyer that I took on one particular very small company and a handful of individuals that started it out of Beijing, that led to me helping them grow the company and becoming this interesting conduit between the two countries. And it wasn't any sort of premeditation of going, oh my God, this is my ticket. You know, it was more about, well, I got fired. What are my options? What seemed like the most interesting? I saw what was happening in China at the time and I thought, wow, this could be a really interesting opportunity. Let me dive into it and hopefully that's the right move. And it turned out to be one. And although now obviously I'm sort of bringing to light some of the difficulties and the problems that created.
So around what years did you make the transition? What was went from William Morris to?
So I started working with that Chinese company as an agent around the year 2000. And then I ultimately got fired from William Morris right at the end of 2001, beginning of 2002. So I really sort of dove headfirst into the China stuff around 2002.
Sure. And you do, Jerry Maguire is an ongoing reference in the book. Is there anything like Jerry Maguire where were you able to bring any of your, like China ends up being your Rod Tidwell, but were you able to bring any of your William Morris clients with you in the post-William Morris world?
Yeah,
I forget my ignorance. I don't know how it works.
Yeah, no, I was able to bring several writers with me that were extremely prolific. And then we talked about the movie Friday Night Lights, and I was able to bring a young client named Lucas Black and a handful of other, actors like Sam Huntington, who played Jimmy Olsen in Superman Returns and things like that. So there was a business that I was able to bring, but it wasn't the booming business that I had at William Morris. And I did feel in a way at the time of getting fired that literally all I had in my hand was a goldfish.
Who's coming with me?
Yeah, no one followed me out the door, I'll tell you that.
Okay, so you make this transition and you start to get introduced to China. What were your first impressions, and would it be fair to say that really the only major American cultural organization that had some access to the Chinese market was the NBA at the time, in that the NBA came prior to Hollywood cracking in?
Well, that's not exactly.
Well, actually, ping pong maybe is earlier in your story. You talk about ping pong diplomacy.
Well, by the way, the book was the genesis of the book came out of an op-ed that I was toying with called "It's Hollywood's Turn for Ping Pong Diplomacy," and it was just and obviously I don't want to come off as dovish towards this whole relationship because I have gotten a lot more hawkish, but I'm sort of putting my hat on back in the day, so that's what we're talking about now.
Yeah.
Ping pong was arguably one of the straw that broke the camel's back, or the catalyst for ending the true Cold War. And by the way, I saw you're a major study of Cold Wars. The Cold War that was going on between the U.S. and China, which really wasn't a Cold War per se, because China wasn't even much of a entity to have a war with. But post-Korean Peninsula War and prior to about 1971, we had completely frozen relationships with China. We had no trade and we had no communication. So ping pong Diplomacy, which is a story a lot of people are slightly familiar with, is a small chapter in the book where I talk about this weird happenstance that occurred that sort of opened up a very initial conversation between the U.S. and China that ultimately led to Kissinger and Nixon hitting the ground in 1972. And you could argue that was the beginning of this marriage that was starting to get, courted by the two countries. And then a lot of people talk about 1979 as being really the consummation of these two countries deciding to start doing things together. And then leading into the Tiananmen Square massacre, we started to see companies like a U.S. company, Intel, getting extremely smart about, in 1984, deciding, hey, let's get into that market. Let's integrate ourselves into the cultural fabric, the building of their economy and their building of their tech, sort of infrastructure. And they went to Beijing smartly. And obviously, I'm putting my hat on from the old days of globalism, and said, hey, Beijing, where do you want us to headquarter? Shanghai or Hong Kong or even Beijing? And Beijing's like, no, we don't want you in any of those cities. You go out to Chengdu. And they're like, Chengdu? So Intel started out in Chengdu and literally built Chengdu. And I saw the news today. They're wanting us to close our consulate in Chengdu. Well, a big reason for that is Chengdu is technically the hub of all tech. It's also a hub of their high-speed rail network, too. So it's a very influential first-tier city that a lot of people don't even know exists.
So would it be fair? Okay, so I think ping pong diplomacy kind of frames what you later call Fenton's five forces, right? In other words, it's a sort of a cultural connection that can lead to broader rapprochement between our two countries. Maybe explain what Fenton's five forces are and where you see Hollywood and the NBA fitting within those forces.
Yeah, so when I was approached about writing a book from different publishers, they wanted, some of them wanted like a true expert, for a look at the U.S.-China relationship, which I felt like maybe I could do, but I also thought maybe that's over my skis a bit. In fact, you had a true expert on recently, Bill Bishop, who actually connected us together. That's somebody I could see doing that. I felt like I fell into this weird applied practical expertise between the U.S. and China. So what I wanted to do was explain the journey of how I got there, and then also explain in this weird sort of fog of war how I acquired all this expertise simply by just grinding through the process of getting business done and getting these big projects done and these super high profile cultural, events accomplished. And in explaining how things work over there and the dynamic between the two countries, I've always been, on panels, et cetera, trying to keep it as simplified as possible, because it's like an onion and you can peel it away and it's just more onion peels and more onion peels. So I broke down the relationship between the two superpowers as having five forces that connect them. And the five forces, to me, in a connection can be easily related to a cell phone and a cell tower. You got 5 bars of service. And you know what? If you got 5 bars of service, you can download a Netflix movie and you can call your friend and, on a video conference in, Tokyo, and you can do whatever you want. It's the ultimate, right? And those 5 bars of service in diplomacy between the two superpowers can be broken down into national security interests, politics, human rights agreements, culture, and commerce. I wrote an op-ed for Real Clear Politics recently where I said, hey, these 5 forces of diplomacy, these 5 bars of service between these two countries, or cell phone and cell tower, aren't really working all that well. In fact, I argue that we're down to just 2 bars of service, and that's even in a good scenario. The 3 bars of service that do not work, out of the 5 forces of diplomacy, are human rights. We obviously have huge disagreement on human rights issues between these two countries. politics for sure, which, by the way, is one that has grown on us to understand better, because I think globalism and the mission of rampant globalism, the idea was we would eventually bring China and their political system closer to a Western democracy. And in fact, that was the same exchange I think Britain or the UK thought in regards to giving 50 years for the takeover of Hong Kong. Over those 50 years, China would become more like the West, so Hong Kong would just remain the same after the next 50 years progressed. As we found out, China has no interest in becoming more like the West, or at least the CCP does not. So politically, we do not agree with them on. So then it comes down to national security. Well, if you look at our issues with Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, and various other places, national security, we don't agree. So let's agree to disagree on those 3 of 5 forces. And I said where we can find common ground is in culture and commerce. So that's the area of discipline that I know extremely well. And I also think there are great America First priorities and America First benefits to keeping those 2 of those 5 forces alive. Commerce, obviously, and we can get into this deeper, can create GDP growth in the U.S., can create jobs here in the U.S. And culturally, every time we get a product or service into that country, it does create a bit of an infiltration of Western democracy, Western values, Western principles into the cultural fabric of that country. And remember, the CCP has 92 million members, but there's 1.4 billion people in China. So that leaves another 1.3 billion that if you assume the CCP doesn't get infiltrated by that soft power, that other 1.3 billion can. And if we slowly win them over, who knows? Maybe they do come to the West at some point. I'm not holding my breath, though.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about or illustrate that through your experience with the NBA. Why is the NBA so popular in China? What did LeBron James initially do wrong, and what, in your view, did Kobe Bryant do right? Because that's all part of a story you tell in the book.
Yeah, well, so the NBA is an interesting case study, which I talk about quite a bit because we did a lot of work with the NBA, the CBA, which is the China Basketball Association, and then we were also an agency of record for Nike for many years, and also represented the late Kobe Bryant as a client for endorsements and stuff for a time in the China market. What was fascinating about that American sport is that in the early days, the missions, in the early part of the 19th century, the missionaries had brought the sport to China. And China, obviously, the average Chinese is, you don't see a lot of the size and stature of people in China that as you might hear in the U.S. So football and some of the sports that require massive sort of size attributes tend to not be a big focus by their people. But NBA and basketball, because of the sort of the proliferation of the shooting guard and the point guard, and then guys like Jeremy Lin, et cetera, a lot of the Chinese feel like they can play that sport and play it at a very competitive level. So over time, both ping pong and basketball became sort of part of the cultural athletic fabric of China. And the NBA, particularly David Stern and Michael Jordan, saw that in the late 80s and actually went out of their way when no one was paying attention to China really as much of a market other than maybe Volkswagen and Intel at the time. They got on a plane and went over there and started talking basketball and started talking about their excitement to bring American-style basketball to that country where Western aspirational values and certain things culturally were really exciting to the consumer there. And over time, they kept doing it more and more, which brought Nike and some of the sports industry into it more. And then eventually the NBA started to really get a following there and started to build actually, and this is part of the problems that we face in regards to the exchange of process and IP and tech and expertise skill set, but the NBA started to help China build its own league. right? The CBA. And obviously the CBA and the NBA live nicely in a harmony now, or at least or Mori tweet. But a lot of businesses that sort of did that same thing have found themselves now on the outside because China has built their version much better and has sort of taken over the market in a dominating kind of way, which is something that Hollywood is now facing, which is I was very involved actually in a way that sort of David Stern and Michael Jordan and their successors did in regards to that building of the CBA. I was doing that with Hollywood, with process, skill set, expertise, helping them build their own film industry. And as you see today, Hollywood makes up maybe 30 to 35% of their market, whereas when I started it, we were 90% of the market.
Well, I think this leads to kind of the central dilemma of the book, right? And as I told you before we started, I kind of went into this thinking, oh, this is just going to be a cut and dry story about someone who, like most of Hollywood and all of the NBA, wanted access to the Chinese market to make money, found out how deceptive and coercive the CCP was, and is now warning us about it. I actually think you paint a far more nuanced picture. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I sense, and it's interesting, I think at one point you're having this discussion with your wife in the book about, and you're just kind of honest about, am I telling myself that I'm doing something patriotic and good here, that I'm breaking down barriers, or is that just like the narrative I'm grafting on top of a economic calculus? And so I think for lawmakers like me, it's easy for us to look at the NBA and say, see, King James has bent the knee to King Xi. What started off maybe as a well-intentioned effort to build cultural bridges is now resulted in the CCP having massive economic leverage over the NBA, and therefore the ability to shut down any narrative they don't like. So, well, one, I guess, was that a fair characterization? Like, I guess what I'm saying is I think you haven't given up on those two bars you identified. You still believe in that approach, but you're also candid at the end of the book in particular that recent developments have not been good in terms of those hoping to avoid a confrontation with China.
Yeah, I think what's interesting because the book hasn't hit shelves, and it hits shelves on Tuesday. So no one's really read the book other than a handful of people. And I've gotten comments from some people that after doing interviews on, the Tucker Carlsons or whatever, where I'll look on a comment board and people think I should be thrown into jail for treason. I also have, people in Hollywood saying, why did you write this? Why are you out there bringing this to light? Like, what are you doing? You're ruining your career, right? The frustrating part is that unless people read the book, they're not going to understand the message of it, right? And the message is that if you don't, like, human to human contact is so important in every facet of life, right? And you know this better than anyone, that all you have to fear is fear itself. Well, it's so true. When you don't know anything that you're talking about, it can be really, really scary. So part of what I wanted to do was to really humanize my 20 years of doing this and say, hey, I wasn't some evil doer that was a capitalistic, greedy, crazy, I just want money, I don't care about America, and I work for the CCP's directive or whatever it is. Like, I get how people might see that about me and everybody else that does business with China. And by the way, I don't do any business with China right now. The fact is, there's a fog of war that occurs when you think you have a mission or a purpose. That's something that drives you, right? And if you look at globalism and the mission that our country leaders and leaders around the world had to try to unify the world economically, it looked like a really smart thing. And it also looked like if we opened up China no matter how we did it, if we opened it up to America's products and services, however it had to get done, it worked on behalf of Americans. Not only because it technically made more money out of China off of their consumer base and brought it to the US, but it also spread our influence into that country, a country we're trying to get more like the West. So that mission was what drove me. And as I was driven by that mission, and you see it many times in the book because I bring my wife and my kids and this friend of mine who passed away into it, they're watching it from the outside. And my wife calls me out on it a couple of times and says, are you sure this is the way you should be going about it? Are you sure you're not doing stuff that's not against what you are as an American, or maybe doing too much that the Chinese are asking you to do? And the fog of my war and the fog of the mission that I was on was, okay, that's seeping in. I hear what you're saying, but here's all the reasons that it's good to do, right? And anybody in any argument can justify what they're doing in their head if it's ingrained in their mission and purpose that that's the right thing to do. And we see it all the time in various other instances. So I really wanted to humanize that so that now when I look back at it, I can see why I was doing it. But it's also akin to maybe you hear from doctors that doing, taking this vitamin is really good for you and you do it all the time. And then some people are saying, you know what, they're saying that maybe that vitamin is not a good vitamin and it's causing blah, 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 blah. And you're like, no, I've heard this and that. And then over 20 years, you found out you got a tumor from it. And, you realize you were doing everything you thought was right. And then it turned out to be wrong. So it's a simplistic way to look at it. But I can easily justify in my head why I got caught up in it. And it wasn't because I was a bad person. It was because I was driven by a mission that was given to me by everybody around me and all of our leaders, right? And then on top of it, we had investors and shareholders that were also completely on board with that mission. But now that I look back at it and when I look at the challenge we face as a nation today, I realize, hey, everybody needs to wake up to this the same way I have, right? I get the fact that the Daryl Morey tweet woke up people that aren't involved with China, right? And they're saying, stop doing that with China to the people that are. But we need the people that are, and then the people that are overseeing those people that are, to go, wait a minute, let's be like Chris Fenton and others that have realized they're complicit in something that's not America first, and let's address it. And we need to address it all together. This is not a red and blue issue. I'm trying to be very nonpartisan about it. And I got to say, the right side of the aisle tends to be the only side of the aisle that's talking about it right now. But if that's the only side of the aisle that wants to address it, we're going to lose. We need 95% of America behind it, and then we need 95% of our leadership behind it.
Well, I want to read this exchange that you have with your wife because I think it's beautiful. And if that's okay, I mean, we're probably not going to release this until after this comes out. It comes out on July 24th or 28th. Okay. So
it's totally fine. You have permission to use excerpts.
So it's just closer to the end of the book, and you're having this conversation with your wife, and she's challenging you, and she says, yeah, but every time you feed the dragon, it grows stronger. It becomes more influential. It will only want more and more until you can't stop it. And then you say, if that happens, we'll change course. Meaning, I'll know if that happens. And then she says, I think you may be past that point. And you're almost like, oh man, maybe she's right. And you say, that it was a painfully enlightening moment. My blissful ignorance had vanished. Blindfolds fully removed as we faced the dragon from that moment forward. One, I just thought that was a cool testament to the value of marriage. But I think is emblematic of how honest you are about your thought process throughout the book. And there are areas where I disagree with you. I mean, I think we are in a Cold War with China right now. But I think you've really illustrated the dilemma that a lot of these companies and industries face. And it's easy for politicians from the right just to say Hollywood is evil and the NBA is evil, but it's a bit more complex than that in your narrative.
Well, and by the way, it should be easy. I mean, just as easy as like not understanding the complexities for the right to do that, it should be for the left too. I mean, let's face it. What the NBA and Hollywood are doing, regardless if they tend to be more Democrat, is pandering to a country and working with a country that has massive human rights issues, censorship, freedom of speech issues, has decimated our middle class and exposed supply chain issues and national security. Those are all Democrat principles, right? Like, this is not a right or a left thing. Like, everybody should be upset. But the problem is and I don't know if I'm going to totally address your question here, so we can move on this. But the problem is the soapbox, stance of a leader or a politician, whatever you want to call it, from the right or the left, is not a solution, right? Because to sit up there and say, LeBron James, you got to take a stand against the CCP and back the Hong Kong protesters, or Disney, you have Milan coming out, your two stars just came out supporting the CCP, you got to support the freedom of Hong Kong. That's easy to say. The problem is twofold. One is their directives, they have a lot to lose in China, whereas the politician or the leader that's saying to go do that probably doesn't have a big personal stake. That's number one. But number two is the whack-a-mole issue that occurs, right? LeBron takes that stand. He loses all his endorsements in China. And then the next basketball player comes in and takes a lot of them. And then he's the guy out there. And then on top of it, LeBron can take down the whole league, right? So then suddenly NBA is not in there, and maybe they're competing. The Premier League suddenly starts to get all that airtime in China. And then Bob Iger comes up and makes a stand. Well, investors and shareholders are going, well, wait, we want all the earnings and revenue growth that comes out of China. You just screwed that up. We're going to actually go to the CCP and find out, by the way, the NBA did this. They actually, it's crazy, but they went to China and said, who do you want running the NBA in China? And they brought in the old Alibaba guy or whatever. Anyway, that's what investors and shareholders are going to do to protect their ROI, right? Is they're going to go and say, hey, who do you guys like to run Disney? Because we just fired Iger to make a point that he shouldn't have said anything that he just said. Well, that becomes whack-a-mole, right? Unless we have rules for engagement. And we got to come together as a nation and say, all right, China is different than us in a lot of ways, and we're going to agree to disagree in a lot of those. But we also realize there's real America first priorities that can be set there and successful by bringing money from them to us for our products and services, which can enhance jobs and GDP and also move our soft power influence in that country, et cetera. But in order to do that, what are the rules for engagement, right? Number one is we should say we as a nation are protecting our right to say what we want to say outside of your borders, right? You can censor things there, and you know what? You can penalize somebody for saying something on your soil. But in the United States of America, LeBron James or Daryl Morey or Bob Iger can say what they want to say. And if you want to retaliate against them for saying that, then the weight of our nation is going to back their right. And how are we going to do that? Well, guess what? You want to penalize Disney? All of Hollywood's going to ban their movies from going into your country. All of our sports leagues are going to stop sending their footage over there. All of our athletes are going to stop endorsing your products. And by the way, once we get our rules of engagement together as a nation, we should bring in our Western alliances too, because what I don't want is Disney and Universal to give up that market and then have Telemunchen from Germany and Studio Canal from France and the Bollywood companies coming in and taking all of our space. Like, we need to get everybody together. And in that situation, we suddenly move out of the whack-a-mole and we actually put the weight of the nation behind something that we really believe in. And freedom of speech is one of them. And by the way, it's ridiculous anyway that China is trying to use their mandatory censorship around the world when they can firewall their own people from hearing that stuff, right? So that makes it even worse to me, right? Is Daryl Morey tweets that out. they can firewall it from anybody inside their country from hearing it. Well, from most people with VPNs and the wealthy can get it. But for the most part, most people will never know that tweet existed. But what the CCP wants is that tweet not to exist anywhere else in the world. They don't want somebody in Germany hearing that somebody wants to support the rights of Hong Kong. That's completely wrong. And we got to stop that. You know, we should be able to have those discussions out there. Don't tell us what we can and can't do. You're a different country. Go freeze it out from your own people. You know what? And your people eventually will get mad about that and they'll do something and you'll have another Tiananmen Square at some point. But don't censor us outside your borders. And you know what? Senator Cruz has brought that up in regards to the Taiwanese flag on the back of Tom Cruise's jacket. No, that's another one that we'll censor it inside your country. We'll take it off the jacket. But don't tell us we can't recognize that Taiwan in our nation's interest believe that they're a separate state than China. And the rest of the world recognizes that in a lot of ways too, maybe not officially, but intangibly. And we're going to keep that on the jacket. You can keep that out of the mindset of your people, but don't tell us we can't let people in Germany see that, or people in Argentina see that, or people in Indiana to see that. That's ridiculous.
Well, it's even worse. They didn't just change the flag. They sort of kept the colors of the Taiwan flag, but rearranged. And then for the Japanese flag, they turned the circle into just a triangle, which makes it an even lamer move. Well, can you tell the story of Looper and Iron Man 3, maybe to clarify the line, the useful line? I think you're separating us self-censoring versus recognizing the reality of CCP censorship. Because in Looper, you changed a major, not a plot point, but location deliberately to feature China and be able to market it to China domestically, correct? Yeah. I love Looper, by the way. Let me disclose, I'm a huge Looper, and I did not know. And I actually think having China as the location versus France actually fits the narrative better, because it makes sense that in this dystopian future, the two poles would be America and China.
Well, and that was a big argument that I had with the filmmakers, including Rian Johnson, who went on to direct the Star Wars movies and Knives Out. The future in that movie was supposed to take place in France. The movie stars Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Bruce Willis. They play the same character, but Bruce is the 40 years in the future version of Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And in the movie, it takes place in the relative present day, and then some of the movie takes place 40 years in the future. And the 40-year in the future location was supposed to be France, and Bruce Willis was going to marry a French woman and live happily ever after in France. The argument we had was, hey, this is a movie that would never get into China for a variety of reasons. One was it uses time travel, and time travel is something that's censored in China because China likes to control the narrative of what history was, and they like to control the narrative of where the future is going. So we said to them, hey, we think this movie has a lot of ingredients, including Bruce Willis, that would work in China if we can get it in. So one thing we would like to do is switch your future to China. So when Joseph Gordon-Levitt retires, he wants to go to China because China is the center of the world in the future. And of course, being there, he's going to marry a Chinese woman, which would allow us to showcase a Chinese actress named Summer Ching. China was on board with that idea hesitantly because they weren't sure, because in the future in that movie, there's drug use, which is also censored. There's criminal activity, which they don't like having on screen on their soil from U.S. films. So when we finally got Rian Johnson, the director, to sign off on this idea, we then went to the Chinese government to try to solidify getting the movie in. And what we did was we said to the Shanghai municipal authorities, we said, we will work with you to create your city that you're going to showcase in this movie 40 years in the future. So we worked with them, with our design teams, to create these buildings in the Pudong district, which is that you see pictures of it all the time. There's the Bun side of the river, and then there's the Pudong side. And the Pudong side has those massive spears and those huge buildings. Well, we created all these crazy buildings, and then they picked and choose what they liked and also altered them in ways. And then we created this skyline that they were super excited about, because they felt like in a movie like this that would showcase around the world, it would define Shanghai as the city of the future, as the place where everybody wanted to be 40 years in the future, making China the Mecca of the world, right? That was their idea. And by the way, to date, although I don't know for sure right now, but Shanghai's City Hall had replicas of some of those buildings that we built for that movie. And the great thing about that, and looking at it from a commercial standpoint, is it worked. And China allowed us not only to get the movie in, but they designated it as a local production, which is crazy because it was in English and it was an American film, which instead of us getting 13 cents of every dollar that came in box office wise, we got 43 cents of every dollar. And we got to release it during a period where they black out movies from the West. So we had no competition. So we could release it during a time when they have all their other local language movies. So we became a top 10 movie of that year. That was 2012, for a movie that should have never gotten into the first place. And when you talk about how you like the movie, the most interesting moment of knowing that we made the movie potentially a better movie than the original version was in a test screening, where the best testing moment of the movie was a part of the movie where Jeff Daniels, who's a gangster from the future, comes back to the present day and is talking to Joseph Gordon-Levitt and says to Joseph Gordon-Levitt, like, what do you want to do when you retire from being a gangster? And Joseph Gordon-Levitt goes, oh, I'm going to move to France. I love France. And he's like, no, you don't want to move to France. France is not going to be where you want to be. And he's like, no, I want to move to France. And Jeff Daniels is like, you want to move to China? And Joseph Gordon-Levitt is like, no, I don't really want to go to China. Jeff Daniels like slams his fist on the desk and he goes, I'm from the future. You want to move to China. And everybody laughed. You know, it's a serious movie, but it was a fun moment in the film where, you know, we all looked at each other going, oh my God, we actually made the movie a better movie by incorporating China. Now,
I realized, based on the internal logic of the movie itself, that the joke is on the CCP, because, spoiler alert, Joseph Gordon-Levitt shoots himself at the end to stave off a future that he does not want to happen. So who knows? In the actual future that occurs, China may not end up being the most powerful country. This is the paradox of time travel, my friend. This is the Terminator paradox.
Wait, so maybe the people that want to throw me in jail for treason are looking at it wrong.
They didn't realize the subversive point you made. You fooled the CCP apparatchiks. That's awesome. And then in Iron Man 3, which I'll confess I have not seen. I'm not a big Marvel guy. I'm sorry. I did like Thor Ragnarok, though. You pitch originally this interesting story that is actually based on Xi's childhood experience, correct? In Iowa?
Yeah, it was, I mean, one of the toughest parts of the job, but it was really exciting for me too, in a way. And I please, no comments about me going to jail for treason with this stuff. But like, it was always, I was trying to figure out, like, how do you incorporate, because Kevin Feige, who I cite, he runs Marvel, he ran Marvel at the time. I sort of designate him as somebody to look up to as a business leader in America, right? Because one of the hardest parts of that movie was trying to get Marvel to do anything that would help our objective in China. And it wasn't because they were bad people, and in fact they were great patriots, because they weren't as helpful as I wanted them to be. But that wasn't the reason. They looked at the brand and they said, look, Marvel's been around for years. It's Americana. We have fans that we're beholden to. So anything we do, we got to make sure the fans still love. We got to make sure the movie is better because we put some China into it. And we just got to make sure we're amazing stewards of this company. And the one question that Kevin never asked during all that time was, okay, if we do that, how much more money will we make?
Yeah.
Which unfortunately is not a question that is ignored by most other companies and industries, right? So I feel like if everybody was like a Kevin Feige and actually really thought about what they're doing in regards to the health of their company and what they're doing for their employees and for what they're doing for the nation, we probably wouldn't have the same issues that we're all talking about today.
Well,
but
his primary obsession, if I remember correctly, is just remaining true to the Marvel universe, because his view is that it's the fans, the rabid Marvel fans, that got them there, and so he has to make sure that any changes they make have to jive with the Marvel universe. Correct?
Oh yeah, there's an exchange I have in the book, and it's a little lengthy, but it was literally about how he walked through one of the character we put in the book and how it entered the Marvel universe, even where it had nothing to do with the movie and was before even Iron Man started and all that kind of stuff. It was amazing because their fans are so specific and knowledgeable about that universe that if they just plant a new character in there, they get crushed for it. So back to your original question, I was trying to find an interesting character for that movie, and it involved, and I don't want to give it away to everybody, but it involved the kid in the movie, and I was trying to tie it to a very interesting real fact about Xi Jinping and his experience living in the United States of America, which most people don't know happened. He actually lived in.
I didn't know. I learned that from your book.
Yeah, he lived in the bunk room of like a children's bedroom in a house in Branstad's state, and it was the idea. And at the time, Xi Jinping wasn't even running China, but we knew in China that he was the guy. So we figured if we could come up with an interesting tie to his real life experience, like, it would have been a windfall of money. What was good is that Marvel decided that wasn't the way to go, and they had a lot of good reasons for it. But boy, was I disappointed that didn't take place, and I'm pretty elaborate with telling that story in the book.
Well, there's another one I won't spoil, but it involves your alternative ending for World War Z, which I found very interesting. And that's another example I think a lot of people point to of kind of this self-censorship or Chinese pressure can sort of negatively affect. But I wonder how much of that isn't also just tied to the fact that Brad Pitt was in 7 years in Tibet, and so they probably hate him over there for that too.
No, he's a pretty good sized star, but to me, what was, and obviously there's members in the Congressional Task Force that have the book, and I know it's been circulating a little bit with people that I like to know are reading it. It's good in the DC Beltway, and I was pretty excited that Attorney General Barr brought up World War Z in his statement the other day, because that was something I was very potentially involved in. I walked through sort of some of the reasons why we didn't ultimately, implement that plan. But, he was cognizant of World War Z, and I think it's the first time that particular movie had been brought out in public in that kind of way. And it's great that this stuff is at least coming out in the open so that we can start having constructive dialogue about it.
Wait, but why aren't zombies allowed in China? What's the deal with zombies?
Well, remember, China has very strict sort of religious, censorship rules, and zombies are undead, which falls into a mythology that branches into religion. So they're very careful about that. In fact, I talk about us getting Twilight into that market when the studio was having a hard time, and we literally had to rejigger the marketing and promotion of that movie away from vampires, which are undead, and into something more akin to Romeo and Juliet, Titanic.
Okay, so in the sort of final few minutes we have, I want to do some fun stuff. Well, this is all fun, but I did not know that you were involved in Waiting, which I think you appropriately referred to as kind of a cult comedy classic. What was your involvement in that one?
So when I was an agent, Chris Moore, who I brought up as the guy who sort of instilled in me the idea of getting into the entertainment business when I met him at the Olive Garden, he had an assistant that gave me this script called Waiting by a fantastic young writer named Rob McKittrick. And I read it, and I literally was like, wait, this is my existence at the Olive Garden, which I remember so well even today. And I said, we got to figure out how to get this thing made. And we took it out, and every studio wanted it. And then it was bought originally by a studio called Artisan that was famous at the time because of this movie Blair Witch Project, which made them sort of the hot mini studio. Then ultimately they got into financial issues, and we had to make the whole thing independently. And we actually made a sequel to it called it was called Still Waiting. But yeah, that was it. I think the movie was made for $2.5 million, and it made roughly $20 million in the U.S. and it became a cult classic, and it's still one of the movies that I'm most proud of as a producer, and I love the fact that just circumstance brought that script to my desk.
Okay, so here now I want to transition to what is our biggest disagreement. Besides the idea that cultural connection will bring peace and stability in our day, or that Nike is a global company. It's an American company, and it should recognize that. Point Break, I'm not saying the remake is bad. I actually think it's an enjoyable movie. But the original is like the Mona Lisa of movies. Why even mess with perfection?
The Point Break poster behind me. Yeah, that was, and I'm a surfer, and look, there were amazing practical stunts in there. There wasn't anything done CG except for the very end of the movie. But yeah, it just didn't turn out all that well. There's
a lot of cool action scenes though in it, for sure.
Yeah, it just wasn't. We actually made a lot of money in China with it. So in fact, I think we made more money in China than it made anywhere else. And a really interesting side point, if you remember the movie, is the cold open. That's the action sequence that gets you into the film, the first 3 minutes or whatever. That was originally supposed to take place in Shanghai. We had pitched it as you got a huge building in Shanghai, gleaming office tower at the top floor. On the 150th floor is a diamond dealer. These motorcycles come up the freight elevator. They drive through, grab all the diamonds, and then they break through the window on the 150th floor. And they got parachutes that pop out. And because they're Robin Hood characters, they sprinkle all the diamonds on the streets below. Well, when we pitched that to the CCP and the governing authorities over film, they were like, no, you can't do that. And we were like, well, why is that? And they said, well, first of all, they would have gotten caught. They would have never been able to do that because our police force is that good. And even if they got out the building and dropped all the diamonds to all the less fortunate people on the street below, in China, people wouldn't have taken those diamonds. They wouldn't take the diamonds that aren't theirs. So it's just completely unrealistic. So we scratch that and shoot it instead in Germany. So anyway, but yeah, sorry that movie got made.
Well, you should. I hope you at least looked the Chinese official in the face and took advantage of the opportunity to just say, "Vaya con Dios, bro," and then just walk away.
Yeah.
Okay, so second to last question. The other poster behind you is Chappaquiddick. Phenomenal movie, but I'm surprised it even got made. Maybe just give us a little bit on behind the scenes of how Chappaquiddick came to life and whether you got any political blowback for that.
Yeah, these writers, Taylor Allen and Andrew Logan, they showed me this script that they had written, an early version of it based on the police records around the Chappaquiddick incident. And I had read it, and my partner at the time, a guy named Chris Coles, read it too, and we were like, wow, this is fascinating. And I said, God, it's so crazy. I know about this story, but I didn't really know about it. And I grew up being a fan of the Kennedys and lived on an island north of Palm Beach, and you knew they were down there across the inlet. And I'm like, we got to try to figure out how to sell this thing. And we took it out. We couldn't sell it to anybody. No one would buy it. But it became one of the hottest scripts in town. Like, everybody loved it. And eventually we found these financiers that decided to finance it independently. And what was amazing is that even with the money and the ability to go make this movie, we couldn't get a U.S. Actor to star as Ted Kennedy. No one would play it. They were too nervous about playing that role in what could be a controversial movie. And by the way, if you've seen the movie, it's not an Oliver Stone type of controversial, like Ted Kennedy was terrible kind of thing. It wasn't made by, a hard right entity that wanted to slam the Kennedys. It was actually a very respectful and sensitive look at we talked about fog of war earlier, sort of the fog of war around what happened to this very complicated character with lots of influences and people around him, and a very tough dad, and a terribly tragic moment for him and this poor woman and American history, and how all these people and all these forces and influences were trying to put him in position to be president, influenced him in terrible ways to do things that he shouldn't have. And it was an attempt to also show the vulnerability of somebody who you really wanted to do the right thing, and how they ultimately sort of did a lot of wrong things, terrible things, and the tragedy that occurred. And then also the look over there kind of thing about the man walking on the moon, which distracted the whole nation's interest in the thing too. So fortunately, we got a great lead actor from Australia and a foreign director to direct it. And we even got Kate Mara in the movie, who, by the way, is the niece of Congressman Tom Rooney.
That's right.
And it turned out to be a great film. And I will say, up until the very last moment of releasing that, we got a lot of very difficult phone calls, threatening phone calls of shutting down theaters or whatever it was, because people were really nervous about that. But ultimately, when they saw the movie, I feel like Democrats and Republicans, no matter what they think of the Kennedys, actually thought it was a thoughtful movie, and it also allowed them to continue to think the same way I guess they did, but with like a little different perspective.
It really is an exceptional movie. Although, and I say this as chairman of the Australia caucus in Congress, we need to do something about all these Australian actors taking all of our American parts. Can't trust these guys. This tradition goes back a long ways.
Yeah, it's Australia and the UK, and quite frankly, both of those countries are taking a lot of our production out of this country and moving it to their countries, which is a jobs problem here in the U.S. too. So it's something that we need to address. I'd like to address China first, but those are other issues. But before we finish, like, I know your track record education-wise with the military, with intelligence and all that stuff is bar none. It's super impressive. And once again, I'm honored to be on the show. But one thing I wanted to mention that you should keep in mind with that kind of background is culture and the power that it has, either as a tool for diplomacy or as a weapon, right? And I bring up the weapon side because if you haven't listened to this podcast, you should, because I was listening to your Congressman Hurd interview the other day, and he had talked about the movie Argo. The CIA has been using culture for many, many decades to influence certain things to happen. Some of the ones we know of that are true are, sending black jazz musicians to Africa in the 50s from America to try to culturally influence those countries to go Democrat rather than go to the Soviet Union side of things, right? And it worked. And another one which Congressman Hurd brought up was Argo, which was fully allowed by the CIA, and access was given to Hollywood to learn about that story and to adapt that story into a fantastic film. There's a podcast called Wind of Change, which addresses the Scorpions song Wind of Change and how possibly the CIA used that song to culturally weaponize that the Scorpions into infiltrating the Soviet Union and pulling them into a democracy and breaking it up and taking the wall. It's an 8-part episode, and it's fantastic. And by the end of it, it's not entirely clear whether the CIA used the song or not, but they get into how Limp Bizkit was used 24/7 to blare at Noriega, who was hiding in the embassy in Panama when we were trying to, take him into control, and how different other ways the CIA has used culture. But the point I'm bringing up is that whether we look at how to address China using culture and commerce as either a weapon or a tool for diplomacy, it really doesn't matter. The bottom line is there is an America First initiative and success story in keeping those two bars alive for the biggest hawks or the biggest doves.
Mm-hmm.
But the rules for engagement and the laws that we have to abide by as a nation and the way we expect our industries and companies to use that as an initiative for America First principles have to be addressed and figured out and abided by everybody. And then I do think a strength in numbers with our Western allies is also going to be important. But I've written op-eds about it, and I really do think that looking at culture as either a weapon or a tool for diplomacy can satisfy both sides of the equation. And I'm not saying there's plenty of hawks on the blue side and on the red side, and I'm hawkish also. But it's just a means to an end. And I do think we can figure this out as a country and put the weight of the country behind a relationship that does work, because whether we are in a Cold War like you think or not, which I'm torn on, because I think of Cold War as just no entanglement of commerce or anything, right? And we have so much money going back and forth. It's hard for me to see Cold War, but we actually are in cold battles, that's for sure, and are in some unrestricted warfare segments for sure. But to avoid a Cold War, or if we are in a Cold War, to avoid an actual kinetic war should be the goal.
Well, I agree with that. Yeah, no one wants a hot war. And I actually take your point. I mean, that culture is upstream of politics. And this is something I often confront because I don't really spend a lot of time fighting the culture war because there's so many people on the right doing that. And I'm more interested in geeky defense, geopolitics stuff. But I definitely think there's something to what you say. However, and maybe I just want to press you on this. I think a lot of people on the right look at the people who are creating culture, whether they're in Hollywood or academia or the entertainment industry or the sports industry, and see a narrative that America is not the good guy in this competition, that America is indeed an evil place, and that, hey, maybe it's not so bad if the future is dominated by the Chinese because we're not so great. It's hard to build bridges if that's sort of their fundamental view of the world. And one thing I appreciate about your book is you made me realize that it's not that cut and dry in Hollywood. Hollywood's not just a den of, commies and, fellow travelers and useful idiots. But I do think that's part of the problem for those who would like to, on the right, have a more productive relationship with the cultural elite. Does that make sense?
There's a lot of bridge building that needs to occur. And quite frankly, I mean, I have a hard time believing we can't succeed at that, because whenever you leave your bubble, I think 9 times out of 10, you're really surprised at how much you have in common with the other side. I mean, there's always people you're never going to win over, and you just got to agree to disagree and move on. But 9 out of 10, and that's all you need to win and get this challenge to tackle, 9 out of 10 times you're going to find plenty of common ground. And the Hollywood's a bunch of commies. Like, I don't know. Look, there's a lot.
I was being provocative. I obviously, yeah.
No, I get it. Look, there's a lot. I mean, I have a lot of friends in Hollywood, and I am not on the left side of the equation by any stretch. I'm a country first voter, but if anything influences Hollywood, it's the same influence that tends to influence the right side too, and that's the dollar. And until we start to think about the nation first before capitalism, it's a tough nut to crack. And I'm sure you can label anybody that's thinking about the buck whatever label you want, but it comes down to the dollar. And I do feel like there was a time in this country where, yes, we were free market capitalists, but we also thought about being patriots first. And I think now is the time to start thinking that again. I'm not saying that we just shut off everything and become totally nationalistic and cut off from the world, because I think there's a lot of benefits to a version of globalism that's different than we have today. But we just need to prioritize patriotism over capitalism, starting from this day forward, because every day that we wait is going to make this problem worse and worse.
Well said. So final question. Let's say you come to Green Bay, Wisconsin, because you're scouting a location for a movie about, I don't know, Vince Lombardi. And, you come and have a beer with me, and we're sitting at the bar, and, a young kid comes up and says, "Oh, Chris Fenton, I read your book, Feeding the Dragon. I love it. You've had a fascinating career. I want to, I'm from Green Bay, but I want a career in Hollywood. I want to be a producer, an agent." What advice would you have for that young Wisconsinite?
Well, number one, I would say is you can go get that career just as easy as anybody that grew up in that environment, because I did it myself. And then I would go back to the Rolodex card theory, which is, I look at everybody you meet as a potential winning lottery ticket, and to win the lottery, the best way to do it is to own all the tickets. So, after you graduate college and you live it up for your 22 years and sort of get a good foundation of who you are and what you want to do and a zest for life, move out to LA and start acquiring lottery tickets, which means network, connect with as many people as you can, learn about the business as much as possible through those conversations and by reading and all that stuff. And then look for that first in, and it usually comes from very low level people that happen to know other very low level people. And you go get that low level job, which, by the way, my first job, which I talk about in the book, was as a temp fax clerk in the music department of William Morris. And then I worked my way up to get promoted to the mailroom, right? Which, by the way, try explaining that to your parents who just saw you graduate from an Ivy League school. And try to sound like you're excited about it and get them excited about it, because it didn't work for me. But they supported me, obviously, the whole time, not financially, but just as being great parents and nurturing. You work your way up and you look for opportunities, and keep in mind, have a great North Star to try to follow, but also look for opportunities that might deviate from that North Star, because sometimes you got to go a roundabout way to get there, and just grind, man, and love life. Because the more you love it, the more you'll live it. And every time you're doing something other than sitting on the couch watching TV, things happen.
Well said. Great advice, Chris Fenton. The book is Feeding the Dragon. Fascinating read, fun read too. So. And again, when's it coming out?
Comes out on Tuesday, the 28th of July.
Well, I'm not allowed to promote it, but I'll just say I read it and I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah, so I'll promote it. You can pre-order it as soon as you hear this podcast, or you can buy it on bookshelves starting July 28th. And you can follow me on the Dragon Feeder. I'm starting to like the Twitter thing, because it's I sort of have a nice interesting point of view that's a little different from the true China experts. So I invite you to follow. And any other information you need, feedingthedragonbook.com, you can find it. But totally honored to be on this show. I really, really, really am excited that somebody like you is helping to lead our country during a very difficult time. So impressed with your background, and I'm looking forward to having that beer up there in Wisconsin or in DC or down in Santa Ana if you go back for a high school reunion.
Well, you have a standing invite to Northeast Wisconsin. So, Chris, thanks so much, man. This was great.
Thank you, Michael.
Take it easy.
The dude abides, yeah. The dude abides. The dude abides, yeah. The dude abides.